Bam! What's up, folks? MC is in the house. All right. What's going on, folks? My name is Justin Garcia, also known as Master Chem, and welcome to the Warrior Stream. It is my weekly live stream, and I am here every Wednesday at noon Eastern Standard Time. And I have a good time doing it, and those of you guys that usually show up have a good time along with me. So let's see who we got. Right now, we are streaming on YouTube, on a couple of Facebook pages, and on X. And looking at comments. What's up, Jesse? What's up, Corey? If you guys are watching, do me a favor, let me know that you are there. I like giving you guys shout outs. And I also like seeing, a lot of the regulars coming out and hanging out along with me once a week. Got a pretty good topic prepared for today. I carry a little notebook. Johnny Groove, what's up, brother man? And I wrote down, Jamie, what's up? I wrote down the outline for today, trying to organize my thoughts. I'm always looking to optimize my rituals, whether it's my morning ritual, my email rituals. Like, I'm all about rituals, right? I'm all about trying to find a better way to do things. And better could be I'm doing them with less resources. Could be that there's a bigger output for the resources I'm currently investing. It could be just sort of resyncing what I'm doing with who I happen to be at the moment, or, getting the rituals to sort of align with what my current goals are. But it's an ongoing process, and one I enjoy engaging. But all that being said, I wrote the outline for today in my little notebook right there, and we will be going over it today. So the name of today's talk is The Cult of Mediocrity. And if you look at the thumbnail for today's show, I described this family watching a dollar bill on the screen where a large screen TV would be. I described it as cult-like behavior. And I think when we start looking at what a cult actually is, and we start looking at how people are being trained to conduct themselves, or not only conduct themselves, but to conduct themselves in order to find fulfillment, right? We start to see that it starts to resemble something that is artificial, right? And artificial in that it is not something that people would normally do or pursue without the installation of that culture by the tribe or the cult itself, right? So what the hell am I talking about? So let's get into what this list I have. Right? I have 5 points that I'm going to discuss regarding why society is trying to sort of rip you from yourself, I think is a good way of putting it. Big Derek, what's going on, brother man? Good to see you. And let's start off with point 1. All societies have a minimal level of conformity. All societies have a minimal level of conformity. So there is this contrast, this battle, if you will, that's being fought constantly between confirming who we are and conforming to become who we are. When we are confirming, we are using our environment to establish sort of like a echolocation, if you will. We use our environment to remind ourselves who we are, what we stand for, what we don't stand for. When we are using conformity to pursue identity, it's really looking for the feedback from our environment to tell us who we are, right? So I would say that, the big difference between the two is where the control lies. In confirming your identity, you are ultimately making a decision on who you are based on the feedback of your surroundings. But conforming to become who you are is really leaving all of the control and inputs external to yourself, right? So that being said, there is, however, a minimal level of conformity. You got to understand, the more conformity, the less friction, right? And that's just a tribal dynamic, right? An alliance or a relationship dynamic. The more overlapped two identities are, the less they spend time in the offset aspects of their personality. If you find, I remember, if you guys have ever seen a TV show, The Wire, right? I only watch old TV shows, right? And I've gone through recently The Wire again, and there is a character on The Wire called Bubs, right, or Bubbles, and he's a confidential informant for one of the detectives on the show. And for a season or two, he had this like sidekick with him. He wound up having multiple sidekicks throughout the show, but there was this one, like he was, I guess, Hispanic or black, Bubs was, and he had this white guy, and they're both crackheads, right? They're both drug addicts. And the dynamic between them was Bubs was the senior crackhead, right? And he was always telling his sidekick, I'm going to school you on what we need to do, because their life was basically just scavenging to generate enough money to get high. Like that's their life. Well, these two individuals could have come from complete polar opposite, places in society. But because they both decided one day to become crackheads, they wound up being completely overlapped in what their mission was from day to day. And that is what conformity does, right? Conformity allows you to experience your life in sync with the people around you. Now, obviously, there's a problem when you do not want to conform and there is a pressure to conform. You're not going to find an easy time being part of a group that wants you to do things you don't want to do, or wants you to be somebody you are not going to be, right? Neither want to be nor are capable of being. So we have to look at society and say, well, if everybody refused to conform in some way, it would be chaos and it would be unsustainable, right? So back to the original point, every society is going to have a minimal level of conformity. Now, if we look at the history of America as an example, and this is reproduced throughout history, but using America as an example, when societies or when the individual groups of people came from cultures that were very much overlapped, right, that had a lot in common, there was less friction when these groups came into contact. However, that doesn't mean that there was not friction amongst these groups. The more a group has in common, the easier it is for them to participate in life and its rituals together. So again, we need to conform to a certain point if we're going to have a functional society, and that's just non-negotiable. You do not need to identify yourself as a conformist just because you acknowledge that there is a minimal level of conformity that we all participate in society. I would say that if nothing else, it is the negotiated agreement we have with society that we're going to conduct ourselves a certain way because we understand the consequences of not doing so, right? So we can make a decision based on some quid pro quo criteria as to why we conform, but conform we do. Next point. One of the things you'll see in society right now, and I think this is part of the motivations of society right from its inception, in terms of like starting a country or starting some sort of artificial identity and recruiting members and participants in that identity. I think this next point is relevant to all such cases. And the point is, there is going to be an inherent replacement of natural resources. So what does that mean? If you look at society right now, there are people who are told that what they need to eat just happens to be something that is artificially produced. People are told that what they need to do are things that just happen to be artificially manufactured. Rites of passage or places to go that people need to participate in just so happen in society today to be places and rites of passage that are engineered by other people. So in a society where people are looking to become of greater value to the people around them so they could accumulate value and wealth themselves, it is helpful for them. It is strategic and effective for them to convince other people that those other people need what they happen to be in control of. Well, on a societal level, you'll see that happening, and that you have individuals that no longer know how to participate in a natural setting. And it seems like something of a simplistic observation or point to be made, but I think in its simplicity lies its value, in that it doesn't take, a great amount of mental bandwidth to get it. I was talking with one of my coaching students the other day, and I asked him, I said, "You ever bring your kids to Disney World?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Why do you think you did that?" And he said, "Well, I think it's, I wanted my kids to have a good experience." And I said, "Well, you could have brought your kids to a boat ride in the Amazon, a safari in Africa. You could," and I just named these exotic, just off the cuff type scenarios that would also be completely unique and engaging and create incredible memories for your kids. But he opted for Disney World. Now, in this day and age, I refuse to say that Disney World would have been cheaper than any of those other things, but he chose for that. And after a little bit of back and forth, he acknowledged that, well, he had gone to Disney World as a kid, and he had all these positive associations, and those associations informed his decision as to what he wanted to do with his children, to give them those types of experiences. And that is as an example, why Disney has been so effective. It's managed to convince people that in order to be good parents, you need to participate in the service that they provide. And I think that is something that we need to just be aware of, right? They're like, listen, and don't take me as some sort of guru who's presenting himself as somebody who's figured this all out in application. I'm on the ladder like anybody else. Case in point, here I am drinking a Monster, right? If Monster stops being manufactured today, two things will happen. Number one, I'll be aggravated, but number two, I'll probably be better off for it, right? And I think that's something that we need to wrap our heads around. This notion that everything that we participate from day to day, we should be able to sort of run it by the filter. Is this manufactured by another identity? And has it been installed in me that I need to participate in this thing, or I need to possess this thing? Getting back to the thumbnail, it was a family watching, what should have been like a television set, but it was a piece of money. I think I managed to capture a lot of different elements where we see this particular point in life today. You have this idea that people, are successful if they have a big television. You have this idea that money is the most important thing and therefore should get the bulk of our attention. And again, I would argue that obviously TV is an easy one, but money itself is also an artificially engineered source of value. And it's not to say that while dealing with the aquarium, I mean, here I am on the internet with all my fancy lights and camera and stuff. Like, I'm also a product or somebody who is in the aquarium, even though I refuse to be of the aquarium. I still participate, in the aquarium, but I think it is really on the individual to understand the level at which he is participating. I think the value in understanding or coming to that realization is knowing when, something was taken for you, as an example, that you really shouldn't be too concerned about. You think about all the sources of stress and anxiety today. I'll use an easy example, adolescents online, getting bullied or insulted or in any way, attacked online. At that stage in their development as an individual, they're so fragile, and exposing themselves to that sort of resource or input of really unvetted people who are disconnected from the positive outcome of the adolescent, it's a very vulnerable way for them to go about developing who they are. None of my children have social media accounts. They're not They're not allowed to participate on social media platforms insofar that they interact with other individuals. It's not to say that, my kids don't have their circle of friends that exist in the real world that they use, like I'm thinking of Messenger Kids or something like that to connect with, or that they all get together to play Minecraft on their tablets together. But we don't participate in social rituals with strangers on the internet, right? And one of the big reasons for that is I need my children to develop who they are as an identity and an individual prior to exposing themselves and the vulnerability that goes along with that exposure to people who have no vested interest in their success. Why would you let people who don't care about you have input on what you think of yourself? When put that way, it makes sense. But when we look at the practice of most people these days, they're going against that on a regular basis, right? I myself, anytime that I've ever gotten aggravated because of some troll or hater, it is that in action, and I have the wherewithal to at least identify that, The third point I wanted to make today: propagandized fear of isolation. Propagandized fear of isolation. I think right now people are being persuaded. Some people have already been persuaded, but people are at least being exposed to the message of persuasion that good and bad is the same as conformity and rebellion. You are a good person if you conform. You are a bad person if you rebel. Now, the only way that an individual is going to be able to tell the difference and find his way despite that propagandized fear of isolation is if he knows who he is to start with. If you do not have a functional relationship with yourself, you are always going to be sort of at the whim of the approval of other people. The worst iteration of that is when those other people are completely disconnected from any positive outcomes that you're trying to create. So there is a fear of isolation in the form of nonconformity that we see everywhere. We see it in the last couple of years with COVID, that fiasco. You see how many people. I have people in my family. Again, I brought this up before. It's still like I still can't just understand it. But they disallowed other members of the family from participating in holiday rituals because of vaccine statuses or any other, well, this person's against this or that, so we don't want them to be like this. These are families. These are brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, like cousins. Like these are people who are connected in the real world in a real way. Yet exposure to the propagandized fear of isolation, having morality somehow be equated to conformity, has people rejecting their own family members. So propagandized fear of isolation is a big one, right? Point 4, incentivized conformity. Incentivized conformity. Society right now, how is it convincing people to become mediocre? It's incentivizing them to do so. Think about the dream of Americans having, the whole, the saying of the white picket fence, right? And all the goals that individuals may have in society that might actually be positive things, but just the idea that the manifestation of these successes in life weren't things that the individuals come up with themselves. They're basically installed in the individuals through various ways. And what winds up happening is you'll get that sort of incentivized conformity in the form of some sort of hormonal reward, right? You get the dopamine drop when you are, or dopamine hit rather, when you conform to the sort of tasks that were assigned to you, right? When you jump through the hoop that they put in front of you, they've trained you to have a positive reaction to that. And I think when you look at how when people become addicted to things being easy, you'll see how easy it is for somebody to control them. Very similar to the point I made earlier of the replacement of natural resources. You have in this a replacement of an individual's ability to be proud of themselves. It's like, no, if you do the things we tell you to do, we will have everybody tell you that you should be proud of yourself. Obviously, the other side of that is if you don't do what we're telling you to do, we will not have any social reinforcement of you having done a good thing. So when you look at how people are conditioned, and if you've ever studied operant conditioning, then you understand the dynamics that I'm talking about. But in operant conditioning, we see a mechanism of basically getting an animal to act the way we want it to act. When it's doing the thing that we want it to do, we reward it by giving it something. We could also reward it by taking something away that it doesn't like. If the animal is doing something we don't want to do, we give it a punishment or we take away something that it values. This is operant conditioning. When we look at how our society is set up, then it doesn't really take a social scientist or a math whiz to figure out what the reality is. The last point that I'm going to make today is sort of a positive one. I wanted to end on a good note, right? I don't want to be Mr. Doom and Gloom that makes the videos about why we're all going to hell in a handbasket and, save yourself. Nobody's going to make it out alive or any other type of message. I want to end it on a good note. So what I'll say is, if you master yourself, the ecosystem isn't relevant. If you master yourself, the ecosystem is not relevant. So my point, if you've read Tribalnomics, there is the image of the individual with a wall around him, right? And that wall in the book that I've written, link in the description, is the wall of self. And when I talk about an individual becoming powerful, what I'm referring to is that wall in my model. And basically it means the integrity, the safety of who an individual is to himself is intact when that wall is solid. And because that wall is solid, he can put himself in different environments without losing sense of who he is. If you have a society where somebody has not mastered themselves and they have not created a strong wall that completely surrounds them, then they are always going to be vulnerable to the ecosystem they're in. As individuals, we cannot breathe underwater. If we are underwater, we have a problem. We would need some sort of apparatus to allow us to make up for the vulnerability, right? The deficiency that we have in our natural state. So we either bring something to help us breathe or we don't go in the water. Well, similarly, there are levels of intensity, there are levels of uncertainty that some individuals are not designed to be able to withstand. And what they will do is they'll always look for tools and gadgets and external sources of help and aid to be able to function in those environments. Well, what I'm advocating for is taking a sort of step out of that situation and just work on you. Understand that whether or not you're a good person or a bad person comes from an external source of navigating one's life. It is not for the outside world to tell us the value of us to us. So if you master yourself and do the work to sort of create that closed loop, right, that wall, that strong wall of self, you will put yourself in a situation where you can be in any scenario without losing a sense of who you are. Now, it doesn't mean that, like, oh yeah, if you have a good sense of self, you can go into the woods and not lose your mind. That might be part of it. But what I'm talking about is what happens, and a couple of guys have some real life reps with this a few years ago when everything goes sideways, when maybe you lose your job, or maybe, like in my case, you're legally obligated to shut down your business. When you have people that you care about that are suffering physically, medically, whatever the case is, can you still wake up and know who you are and what you're about in those types of circumstances? Or, to draw a contrast, are you the individual that so long as everything's going great, you're great as well? There is a very small utility in being aligned with people that are only great in great positions. Again, I'll refer to my family members who, prior to the whole COVID fiasco, these are stand-up people, maybe a little more normie for my taste. I got a lot of normie family members. But I would have said generally they're good people. COVID hits, and they're now all exposed to a level of intensity that, similar to something being exposed to a heat past its melting point, all of these individuals melted. Now you'll have other people that prior to COVID you would have thought of as being, maybe middle of the road, neither good nor bad, just sort of lukewarm. They're just sort of there. But when COVID hit, they didn't change one bit. They didn't become nervous and scared and spiteful. And locally here in Pennsylvania, there was a friend of mine who has an Airbnb. And this couple, these friends of mine that have this Airbnb, had rented out their Airbnb for a long term. COVID hit, got some people that got out of the city. They wanted to move here, rented it long term. At some point, you can't make this shit up. At some point, a neighbor from up the road came down to the Airbnb and knocked on the door. When the renters opened the door, the neighbor started chastising them for spreading COVID. You people from the city are spreading COVID. It's like, never mind the low IQ that has to be connected with that type of logical process, but just think about the fragility of what you think to be neighborly connections when just that bit of intensity and people are reduced to that level of behavior. I have a very small circle of friends, and sometimes new people enter that circle, sometimes people leave that circle. But and this is my criteria for my circle, if you're going to be connected to me, you have to be of a very high melting point as an individual. If you're somebody who, after a certain level of intensity, turns into somebody else, I don't have a lot of use for you, right? And I don't invest in relationships that reveal themselves to be that, right? So my parting bit of advice is every individual needs to work on them. You need to educate yourself. You need to become healthy. You need to have an honorable relationship with your body, right? Honor the machine is one of the phrases I've used. You need to get away from the hustle and bustle of artificial environments. If you live in a city, you need to get out of the city every once in a while. You don't need to live in the city permanently, Cities are always going to exist. We could sit there and say, they shouldn't, and I agree with all of those things in terms of the just the destructive nature of what a city is. But if I'm going to offer a ritual to help somebody, it's going to be every once in a while you got to get out of it. Every once in a while, you should be investing in things like meditation. Meditation, the exploration of you inwardly. Severing all of the stories and all of the stray voltage that we're exposed to during the course of the day. These are the things that we need to ritualize. You do those things to a functional level and build that wall of self. The next time shit hits the fan, you're not going to miss a beat. Let me answer some questions here. Corey says, I like the past the melting point metaphor. Right on. It's one I've used often, and I think it's pretty much indicative of what you see happen to people. It's like they're fine right up until it gets hot, and then as soon as they start to melt, you know what you're dealing with, right? Terrytown Vibe. What's up, Terrytown Vibe? He says, why are we so fragile when it comes to our identities until we're forced to change? Because we were able to be, right? The reason why people are fragile, think about the fragility of a spoiled child. They're spoiled. They don't get what they want. They immediately have some sort of a meltdown. Why is it? Because they were basically trained to have a dysfunctional level of expectation. And I would say a lot of people, first world people, first worlders like us, there are so many things we take for granted to the point where we expect them. We feel entitled to these things. Yet it doesn't take that much to look around the world or some of the worst parts of our country here and say that and observe that a lot of people don't have those things. They've never been in a position to expect, let alone entitle, some of the things that we don't even think twice about. So one of the reasons we're so fragile is because our environment has protected us, and we've never had the need to grow that protective ability ourselves, right? So it's why, obviously, running a martial arts school for 20 years, why I am an advocate for training in violence. Why? So that you have a functional relationship with it. So you do learn who you are in a very unwelcoming, stress-filled environment. I've seen a lot of people who are successful in life by any criteria that an average person would have, but the first time they're in a jiu-jitsu class and they're held down and they can't get up, they have a nervous breakdown. Their whole relationship with reality is compromised because they've been in a situation they've just never been exposed to. And for those that go through that and continue to train, they wind up building that aspect of themselves that they've never had to up until that point. So sometimes we're walking around with vulnerabilities that we're completely unaware of because the situation or the scenario to actually expose them, we've just never come into contact with, right? All right, guys, I'm going to call it there. That was a solid push. I appreciate you guys hanging out with me. It's a topic that is near and dear to me. So much of my coaching, in business, whether it's one-on-one or in one of my groups, at some point, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, I have to convince these gentlemen that I deal with that they need to invest in building that wall of self. And that they're the commonality in a lot of failed attempts at pushing past these sticking points. The strategies of business certainly are multiplied when you have a solid, capable driver at the helm. All right. So I appreciate you guys hanging out with me. I'm here next week. You guys know that. I'll see you then. And as always, brothers and sisters, pressure to power.